It seems like the Titans looked themselves in the mirror this offseason and acknowledged that whatever version of this Titans team we've seen over the last few years is not going to get to the level required to win a Super Bowl. I think beyond even the roster mentions that I already talked about, or roster moves and sort of transitions they've had, the biggest indicator that this team views its championship window as maybe having already passed and sort of transitioning to a point where they're trying to extend that window by bringing in younger guys and rebuilding a roster that may reflect a team that could win in a few years as opposed to go all in this year, is the fact that Ryan Tannehill did not receive an extension this offseason. It would have been pretty easy for this Titans team to say, okay, Tannehill, you're our guy. You've taken us to the playoffs now 3 years in a row. We feel like we are getting there. Number 1 seed last year. We got to the AFC title game a few years ago. And we feel that you can take us to the promised land, so we're going to extend you. We're going to move your money around so we can maybe bring in some more talent in the free agency market this offseason. But the Titans didn't do that. They don't trust Ryan Tannehill. They have every ability this offseason to simply move on from Tannehill, to cut him after this season and to move in an entirely different direction as a franchise. I'm not sure whether ultimately that's the direction they will go, but if this team ultimately disappoints, I would not be surprised to see Tannehill in another jersey next year and to see the Titans sporting an entirely different roster, really. Even Derrick Henry is a guy who feels like he's been doing this a while in terms of just getting the punishment on his body as a runner, getting those high volume seasons. And if we know anything, it's these high volume seasons for these running backs really start to add up. I'm not sure how many more years Derrick Henry has of being this bruising back who can really sustain this season long production. He's had freakish 2,000-yard production. Even last year, he showed signs of slippage in his underlying metrics outside of, he kept up those stats, those counting stats just by virtue of volume. But if you look at some of the underlying metrics, like he faced more stacked boxes last year, his efficiency was down across the board. Teams were sort of hedging on him because they didn't want to allow Tannehill to beat them. Not all this was him. We got to acknowledge that he was hit behind the line or at the line of scrimmage on like 50% of his carries last year, which was second in the league or something like that. I think only Ezekiel Elliott had a lower rate of rushes where they reached the line of scrimmage without being hit. But still, this is a team that I think is in transition here, that sees the end of the line coming. Even their free agent signings, bring in a younger receiver in Treylon Burks, they're expecting him, they need him on offense to step in and be an immediate difference maker. And we've seen those rookies do that in the last couple of years, Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. But I think those guys have really sort of spoiled us in terms of what we should expect from rookie receivers. Rookie receivers usually don't slot in and replace and play at an all-pro level. Jefferson and Jamar Chase may just be that freakishly talented. I'm not expecting Treylon Burks to step in and reproduce A.J. Brown's production over the last several years. I think he'll be a decent receiver. But what I'm most concerned about with this Titans team is some regression to the mean on defense. Last year, they were top 12 defense by basically every metric. We've already talked about sort of this transition they're going through offensively. So if this defense regresses from a top 12, top 10 unit to a middle of the pack unit, and this offense regresses as basically everyone is expecting it to, then we're talking about maybe a 7-win team, not a 12-win, 10-win team, because this division got a lot better. I don't think there's going to be rollovers with the Texans and the Jaguars again. I just don't see a world in which this Titans team is going over their projected 9.5 win total. 9.5 wins seems like a lot of games here. And you know what? If you look at the odds for where the Titans finish this year, the odds are basically juiced in my favor. I think it's minus 150 right now that the Titans go under that projected win total, and plus 110 or something that they win the division, which terrible odds. Earlier this offseason, they were the favorites to win that division, but we've seen the odds now swing back towards the Colts. In finishing up this Titans assessment, I have this team going under their projected 9.5 win total for all the reasons I just discussed. The roster here is just not what it was. They lose a lot of the star power, with the idea of hopefully keeping this contendership window maybe open a few more years by bringing in some young guys. They don't extend Tannehill. This is a team that sees the end of the line coming for this version of the roster, and I think they're doing what they can to try to be somewhat competitive now without completely bottoming out. And we have to talk about Vrabel. Vrabel, as a head coach, is going to keep this defense in games. I think this defense will actually be somewhat decent, maybe a top 12 unit again, but where my doubts really are is with this offensive unit to repeat the production it's had over the last couple years. I think everyone's getting a little bit older. They lost some star power. I just don't see this team going over their projected win total of 9.5 games. Just before we move on, I'll briefly touch on the prop pick for this team. The prop pick here is really just Robert Woods over 64.5 receptions, and the reason that I'm high on Robert Robert Woods going over that 64.5 receptions is the fact that ACL tears are not what they used to be. He obviously injured his leg late in the season last year, and he slots into an offense where his primary competitors for target share are going to be Treylon Burks, a rookie, who, as I mentioned before, I'm betting against rookie receivers always, and Austin Hooper. I feel that if Robert Woods can stay healthy just by virtue of the target vacuum that's been created in the absence of A.J. Brown, in the absence of Julio Jones, in the absence of all these guys who are just old faces here. I don't see a world in which Robert Woods stays healthy and does not go over 64.5 receptions.